Network to give us a bit of background of why we're here today.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you for moderating today's session, and thank you for everyone who was present with us online and in person. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Today we are talking about the Feminist Migration Policy Agenda, which we will be formally launching ahead of the International Migration Review Forum, where we will be pushing for holding the line on gendered language in the Progress Declaration. The Feminist Migration Policy Agenda is an effort that Women in Migration Network has been working on for a number of years, about 3 right now, that came from consultations and vetting processes with our membership and beyond, with also sister organizations, about the dire need to find different ways to advocate for migrant and gendered rights in the current political climate where multilateralism is being threatened, and where the spaces where we usually meet and discuss and try to reach a consensus towards more rights for women and gender diverse people in the space of migration are consistently under attack, and the civil space is shrinking. And one of the conversations that we have had about the topic is also what happens in the spaces of global advocacy where certain voices are not heard. Usually those are the most minoritized voices, but also it so happens that immigrants in the US are not part of these international spaces because the US is not a signatory on a number of international conventions and has distinct legislation that governs such migration spaces. And therefore, in effort to bridge the gap between various regions, including the gap in migration struggles here in the US, and try to discuss how we can be present as one united, strong movement, we are also having this event here today to highlight the backlash on rights in this context. Thank you.
Thanks. And next I'm going to hand over to Sneha from the Global Forum on Gender and Migration to give us a few words.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roula. Welcome on behalf of the Center for Migration, Gender and Justice. We are delighted to feature this event as part of this year's Global Gender and Migration Forum. Thank you so much, everyone who's joining us online and everyone who's here. The forum is a shared global commons connecting knowledge, policy, and practice on migration and gender. And it is exactly why this event is so important. As a multi-stakeholder mechanism, the forum facilitates collaboration across sectors and geographies, centering migrants' lived experiences and perspectives. So today's event on the Feminist Migration Policy Agenda plays a critical role in this, and we are excited to learn from our colleagues. We hope that you will join us at other upcoming events of the forum, which will last until May 8th. I'm happy to provide further information on what we have planned. I hand it over back to Mayuri. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sneha. So today we have a panel of incredible advocates, feminist scholars, and activists who will be speaking on a range of issues. And I just wanted to start by really commending the Women in Migration Network for this policy agenda, because it is such an expansive and intersectional analysis of what migration, what a feminist analysis of migration with dignity would look like. So just to start with, I'll just give abridged bios for our panelists and put the full bios in the chat just to save us some time. But first we have Shanti Uprety, who is an independent feminist activist and consultant with over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of gender equality, labor rights, migration, and international human rights. She was critical to the development of the Feminist Migration Policy Agenda and Advocacy Roadmap. And she previously served as program manager at the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. Janay Cauthen is an activist and public speaker dedicated to advocating for the rights of individuals fighting injustices, regardless of whether they are immigrants or American citizens. As the director of Families for Freedom, a nonprofit organization, She works tirelessly to support families navigating complex legal challenges. She's also an accomplished author, having written her memoir, which shares her powerful experiences and highlights the systemic injustice she has encountered. Raquel Cruz-Juarez is a lifelong community organizer with over a decade of experience in social justice movements, coalition building, legislative policy, and electoral organizing. She serves as the Senior Director of Constituency Campaigns at Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund, where she supports the growth of Planned Parenthood's Black, Latinx, and college campus nationwide organizing programs. She joins us on Zoom. Janvieve Comrie is the founder and executive director of Afroresistance. Welcome.
Thank you.
She is a human rights strategist, trainer, and organizer with a deep commitment to assist in the building of powerful social movements for gender, racial justice, and human rights. She is an expert on race and human rights and internationally recognized for her work with African descendant communities. So I'll put the full bios in the chat, but just to start, I'll hand over to Shanti just to introduce the feminist migration policy agenda.
Hello. Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry. I'm hearing my own voice. There is like kind of echo. Okay, I have a presentation and I have just put it on the chat. See if you can access it and choose. Is it possible to kind of for you to share the screen, to share the presentation? I don't know if you can, for those who are in the room, those who are attending it in person, I don't know if you can see it or if you have access on your laptop. Thanks. Okay, so I will be using this presentation and thank you for joining today. We launched the report at the CSW 70, and I was in New York in person for that, but I couldn't stay back for the IMRF, and I'm missing being in the room now, looking at the people, those who are there attending the meeting in person. So today I will be briefly providing the overview of the FMPA. And I'm really honored to have this opportunity to be able to work with the women team to develop this policy agenda. And I have 15 minutes, I think, so I'll just start. Next slide, choose, please. So this actually, I keep on saying this, actually everything was already there. So what I did was, this is collectively developed intersectional and human rights-based framework rooted in migrant-led struggle. And when we say right-based framework, the reason why we are saying it is because it positions governments and institutions as duty bearers with binding obligations, and migrants as right holders with legitimate claims, not just service recipients or beneficiaries. So that is why we are presenting it as human rights-based framework. And as I was saying earlier, actually my role was to kind of consolidate all the documents and key information and from various initiatives organized by women, and to kind of give some kind of structure to that information, organize the information, and add my inputs, analyze it. And in that process, some interviews were also conducted. Just to give you a very brief background of how this was developed, the process started last year, towards the end of last year. And as Roula said earlier, but this was the work of last 2-3 years, because the information that we put together was used from the documents and reports that were there for last 2-3 years. So as I said, like this is collectively developed in that sense, and we have been saying this is like a bottom-up approach, collectively developed document. It is designed to guide strategic advocacy and collective action across different levels and different regions. And for now, we have kind of developed it as more like a global document, but there are plans in the future to see if we can customize it and make it more region specific. Useful for CSOs in general, but the organizations working at the intersections of gender, migration, and labor rights. The demands in the report reflect what women and gender diverse people in migration have long expressed through organizing, through their resistance and survival. So that is the core key part of the report, which is which is presented more as the thematic priorities in the report. It calls for activism, not only response to immediate harms, that not only responds to immediate harm, but also challenges the deeper structural issues. And next slide, please. And why a feminist migration policy agenda? And this is our tagline, because it is not optional. It isn't optional, because if we want migration system to advance equality rather than reproducing structural harm, then applying intersectional feminist lens is essential. Because the feminist policy approach interrogates how policies are made. It is not just about like adding number or counting number, but how policies are made, who shapes them, who benefits from those policies, who is left invisible, and whose realities are prioritized or dismissed in policy formulation processes. That's why. And gender, we keep on hearing gender responsive, gender sensitive, but gender responsive migration policy alone is insufficient. Migration governance, as we know, migration governance is shaped by foreign climate policies, labor markets, investment, tax, trade policies. So, without understanding the intersections, how these forces interact and how they impact migrants in all their diversity, it is not. We will continue managing symptoms without addressing the structural problem. That is the reason why we are presenting it as a feminist migration policy agenda. Next slide, please. And how was it developed? I think I briefly spoke about it in the beginning. This is a collective work of many people and many organizations. And many people in this meeting are also in some ways, I believe, have contributed in the development of this report. It is developed through bottom-up participatory cross-sectoral processes and key initiatives organized by Women in Migration Network, particularly two initiatives that we have mentioned here: Leadership in Global Advocacy, LIGA cohorts in 2023 and 24, outcomes from those initiatives, as well as the outcome document from the Feminist Forum on Migration and Displacement that was organized in Bangkok in 2024, where the key initiatives for the information that were like critical for the development of this report. And I would also like to kind of mention the interviews that were conducted with women members and activists. 10 to 12 people that people were interviewed, and their insights, their analysis was very important to have this document, to develop this document. And also we have used the information analytical reports from other feminist organizations, particularly working on on the rights of migrant women and gender diverse people. As well as and as a process, we had the weighting and validation process to collectively agree on some of the conceptual frameworks, and also to see whether we are in alignment with the position of the movements. So that was the process. Next slide, please. And why this agenda now? I think it is self-explanatory. I don't have to explain it. The need, the urgency, and the relevance of this document currently in what is currently considering what is happening globally. We are in a very difficult time, and one of the most alarming periods we have seen in decades. And this is also part of the context analysis is also part of the report. It provides more like global overview of what is happening globally and what are the key challenges when it comes to the the current context globally. And borders are becoming increasingly militarized and externalized, acting not only against migrants but also against its citizens, and normalizing arbitrary arrests and violence. We have also seen humanitarian protections are being rolled back and deportations are being fast-tracked. And we are seeing permanent residents detained for political expression, along with travel bans, visa suspensions. Similarly, the world is experiencing unprecedented institutional intimidation. Some UN agencies, for example, have started removing gender-related, uh, gender and inclusion-related content from their websites, from their platforms. And we are also witnessing the chilling effect of funding cuts, particularly on civil society as a whole, but especially on migrant women-led organizations working on sexual and reproductive health rights. So many groups have had to close, suspend core programs, and continue operating with drastically reduced capacity. Next slide. And so in that context, within that context, this report, sorry, I missed one slide. Choose, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so that was the context in general, but considering the topic, the subject of today's meeting, the report highlights on the situation, how the US rollback on rights and how it has impacted its effect globally, the recent shifts in the United States and how it has extended far beyond its border. Governments that already followed exclusionary policies are now further encouraged by the US rollback on rights. And this is seen in the growing reluctance to use basic concepts like gender and diversity. And this is the kind of tendency of many governments, right? Like if there is something that they should be learning or adapting, replicating positive things, we never see that happening. But something negative, it gets replicated very easily. So that is the situation currently. And the current global movement is defined by the erosion of multilateralism and international norms. That is not just in the case of the US, but the powerful states cutting both financial and political support to the United Nations system. And just an example that we have also included in the report, in January 2026 alone, the US withdrew from 66 treaties and organizations, including 31 affiliated with the UN. And across Europe and the US, border control is heavily militarized with detention, surveillance, and armed enforcement. Entities like Frontex in Europe and the US Department of Homeland Security enforce control measures through border externalization. So this is the context we have seen in the US and how it is kind of the spilling over in other countries and other regions. So Choose, can we go back to, yes, can we go back to the, I think this is the one slide before. Sorry, I kind of know before this, the structural issues, I think, the first slide on structural issues. I'm sorry, Choose.
No problem, Santi. I'm sorry. You tell me, it is like, because we would hear.
Slide number 4. Yeah, structure of the report. Can we go to the structure of the reports?
Yes,
I'll briefly talk about it. Yes, please. Yes. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, just to give you like sense of the structure of the report, executive summary introduction, and we have forward by Patsili Toledo, who is the UN CEDA committee member from Chile, and who is also the co-chair of the CEDA's working group on gender-based violence against women. We have context analysis, the thing that we talked about earlier, and also and that is the context where the report is situated. And structural framework, thematic concerns. There are like 10 thematic areas that we have identified. categorized in 10 thematic areas and the promising practices. And promising practices is not the core part of the report, it is in the annex, but the reason why we have provided it is to see how some of those practices can be replicated in other countries. And I mean, it needs further research to understand what is the advocacy behind some of those practices and how we can kind of make those possible, make them happen. Next slide, please. Next, yes. So structural issues, we have identified 10, kind of categorized them into 10 to 12 areas. So decolonizing border, everything, all the problems related to borders, because we know that borders are shaped by long histories of empire extraction and white supremacy, and therefore any policy response must start by recognizing this reality. This requires shifting away from border security to human security, intersectionality at the center. Migration policies need to be grounded in intersectionality and acknowledging the overlapping and distinct forms of discrimination and disadvantage is important. And we know that when policies treat all women as if they are the same, they erase the experiences of those who face the greatest barriers. And we believe that the report stands strong in terms of its intersectional lens, intersectional analysis. Redistributing power to migrant women. And we are not just talking about involving them in consultations. So we are talking about real decision-making power to migrant women, migrant women. This includes inserting resources flow directly to grassroots groups led by migrant women. And we have provided little statistics and kind of at least 1% of the total, the development budget. Next slide, please. Structural issues, some other structural issues that we have highlighted is challenging dominant narratives and labor hierarchies in terms of like skilled and unskilled hierarchies that we see, and the way care, domestic and informal work is devalued. Challenging corporate impunity and how migration governance is captured by capitalism, privileging profit over people. So it is urgent to dismantle the neoliberal rules that grant excessive privilege to transnational corporations and how it has kind of impacted lives of migrants. Advancing reparative and feminist migration systems. This means moving toward reparative finance, stronger South-South mobility frameworks, and feminist norms to challenge patriarchy. So from the structural analysis, we can see that whatever is happening currently, it is not accidental, and it is happening by choice. And it is kind of predictable outcome considering the current system, considering the models that we have developed. Next slide. Key highlights. This is probably my last slide. I won't be reading the other two slides. Key highlights, just few things I think is really important to highlight here. One is the report examines how corporate interest and global capitalist expansion shape migration systems and deepen exploitation. That something that I talked about in a previous slide. And it also highlights how digital tools intended for protection can be weaponized against migrants for surveillance and control. While reforms to deportation processes in the report, while reforms to deportation processes are proposed to mitigate immediate risks, these are interim measures and do not legitimize punitive migration regimes. The long-standing objective remains decriminalization, regularization, and the creation of safe rights-based pathways. So that was more like a clarification, because there's few demands that we're talking about reforms in the deportation process, but that was more as immediate, addressing immediate risk, not as the final ultimate goal or standard. The analysis situates criminalization beyond harmful narratives. The reason for criminalization is not just because of harmful narratives, but how it is embedded in national security driven migration frameworks and how it is further reinforced by neoliberal austerity policies. And the report calls for decriminalization of sex work and critiques the ongoing conflation of sex work with gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. And last two slides, next slide, please. These are just, I have presented the thematic areas that you can find in the report. There are 10 areas and sub-themes for some thematic areas. Thank you so much. That's all. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shanti.
My beauty, I think that you are talking, but we cannot listen to you. You're mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes?
can.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that overview. I think one thing that I really like about this report is that it acts as a compendium of all these different areas. So, you know, for advocates that are advocating with governments on, say, climate migration, there's a section on that. And if you're looking for promising practices, there's a section on that. So the expansiveness, I think it'll be just such a useful tool for advocates going into the IMRF. So next we will hear from Janay Cauthen, the Director of Families for Freedom, on grassroots community organizing and the effects of the punitive enforcement policies that the US government has taken. Janay.
Good morning, everyone. Today we gathered not just to discuss issues that impact women and families globally, but to ignite a movement for change. As Executive Director of Families for Freedom, I know what it is firsthand to be a woman directly impacted by the broken immigration system. About 23 years ago, I fell in love with a Haitian man. We had two beautiful children together, and he was detained by ICE. I had no clue that he even had an immigration problem because, you know, sometimes we're dating, our partners leave certain things out of their resume. And as a mom, I remember the deportation officer had just told me, just bring his passport, he's getting shipped back. And I said, I didn't sign up to be a single mom. So when I went down to get his property, the deportation officer was like, where's his passport? So I act like a dumb blonde. I'm like, I don't know. I just started screaming because I needed time to process a battle that I never fought before. As women, we struggle with everything. They just recently took away our right to have abortions. And I sat there and I looked at my beautiful children. I said, no, I'm not having this. I stood up when everyone turned their backs on me. They just said, you know what, Janay, just let it go. You made a mistake. You had kids by a wrong guy. And I said, at the end of the day, we all human, we make mistakes. He was convicted as a teenager. His name is Jean Montreville from Haiti. He was convicted for a drug offense in the 80s my time because he's 11 years my senior. And when he got that one phone call, his first thing was like, I'm sorry for not telling you, but he thought that that was swept under the rug because he received a sentence of 33 years for his first offense in the state of Virginia, even though he was from New York. If you get caught selling drugs in Virginia, they charge you with every state you pass. That was already a hefty sentence. I found Families for Freedom as an organization to help me fight against this broken system. I remember having a gateway computer back then. We didn't have high-speed internet. We had to either choose to use our computer or use our phone. So I said, I won't be talking to my friends today. I went to the dollar store, I got like 100-foot cord, and remember, I used to go, and I wrote a letter. The subject was, please help me keep my family together. And I was sending it to everyone. Sabash Cartel, he's the founder of Families for Freedom. He reached out to me. He did the intake process, and he said, Janay, we're gonna get him out. And I said, but they said it was a final order. He said, nothing is final. And it brought me back to being pregnant at the age of 20 with my first child. I remember going to a hospital in Brooklyn called Brooklyn Hospital. I was spotting. So when I went, the room was not clean. The doctor gave me paperwork and it said threatening abortion. I'm like, I'm not trying to get an abortion. I learned that that's another word that they use for a miscarriage. So I remember walking to the train station scared that I was about to lose my child. So I came home, I told my grandparents, and my grandmother was like, they're not God. I went to see my normal PCP in the white neighborhood, and he said spotting is a part of pregnancy for some women because my cervix was stretching. So the same child that this doctor told me that I was gonna lose was born 9 pounds, 11 ounces. So it taught me you can't believe everything people say just because they have a title. You always have to go above and beyond. So now we have this new man in the White House, and he's targeting immigrants. And a lot of women, I had someone reach out to me recently. She's from, I believe, Somalia. If she gets deported to Somalia, they're gonna circumcise her daughters. How painful is that? And she just came here for a second chance. So by me being executive director for Families of Freedom, that was not in my agenda. I'm a civil servant. I work for New York City Human Resources Administration. I'm used to the traditional, you go to work, you get a check. Running a not-for-profit, you gotta get funding, you gotta come speak in front of strangers, you gotta repeat yourself and tell the story so many times. And at 48, I can't believe I started this journey in 2005, where people just told me to give up, and I didn't. Gene was deported under Trump's administration in 2018, but in 2010, I remember filing for a pardon because I started using encyclopedias, looking for ways that can give him some type of second chance. So when I applied for the pardon, it just lay dormant. And I went to speak to his attorney and I said, hey, I understand he's deported, but what about the pardon? He was like, oh, you're not gonna get that pardon, Janay, just give up. So I called the pardon office to check the status. They said it was still pending. So we came together with other advocates from my church and elected officials, and we got the Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia to give Gene the pardon. He got the pardon in 2021. He got his right in court because immigrants are not entitled to their day in court. They can go to court without legal representation, unlike the traditional judicial system where they'll give us a legal aid lawyer. The judge overturned his deportation offer and he was reunited with our children. So I thought, okay, as a woman, I got a break now. So I booked a little trip. And before this trip happened, Gene moved in my place until he could get himself together. He called me at 4 a.m. and he's calling on WhatsApp. So I said, did he leave? And he's like, I'm having bad heartburn. So I said, oh, heartburn at 4 a.m. So the phone just dropped. So I got scared. I didn't want to go check on him, so I called 911. So they said it sounds like he's having a heart attack. So they told me to give him some aspirin or water, and he had to chew a couple of pieces until the ambulance came. So when the ambulance came, I'm like, I'm back into being that strong Black woman. So he was telling them, oh, I'm just having heartburn. My ex-wife doesn't know what she's talking about. They said, sir, she does know what she's talking about. You are having a heart attack. So I felt like I had the world on my shoulders again, because now that he was reunited with the family, I felt I could be free. Like, let the school call him when the kids are acting up. Let me not have to look for a babysitter. And then now I get a phone call stating that they have to rush him into open heart surgery to get stents placed in his heart. And that was during a pandemic. I was anti-vax, so I wasn't vaccinated. In order to get to the hospital, you had to be vaccinated. So our son had just turned 18. So I said to him, so it's time to man up, son. He said, what do you mean? I said, you gotta go to the hospital because I'm not going to get vaccinated just to go into the hospital where I'm gonna get even sicker. So I was able to teach him as a Black mom, you can step up. So he stepped up and he was there for his dad, because I told his dad, because women, we have to be ready so we don't have to get ready. I said, before your dad goes under that knife, make sure he makes you his healthcare proxy, because God forbid something happens where he's incohesive or he has to go to ICU. He needs someone to be able to make these medical choices. And the people that I service with the organization, I teach them the same thing. If you are at risk of being deported, set up a contingency plan. We created this sheet called the Safe Sheet, and it's basically like an emergency contact form. We understand that I understand that it's fearful to be separated from your norm, but I always tell people you have to be ready so you don't have to get ready. we live in a life where you see, we have insurance on our cell phones, insurance on our laptop, but we don't have insurance on our life. We don't have insurance on our children because we think death is inevitable. Deportation is not inevitable. Things can happen at the drop of a dime. So on the safe sheet, they put their name, their A number, if they have minor children. I ask them those uneasy questions, like if something happens to your child, do you want your child to go back to your native country, or do you want the child to stay in the United States with someone you trust? If they opt to have this child stay in the United States, I tell them to make sure you do the power of attorney, go to the family court, do the custody paperwork, because when you're shipped away or torn away and kidnapped, you have no rights over the child you carried for 9 months. The government becomes in charge. And as we saw in years before and still now, a lot of children are going through the ACS system. A lot of these people that sign up to be foster parents are not good people. They're just doing it for the check. So now your child is traumatized because they lost you, and then they may be placed in a home of someone that's not a good person. I also tell them these little air tags that I use because I lose everything. If you're at risk, get an air tag or air towel, put it in the sole of your shoe. So if you are detained at an ICE check-in or just walking the street, your loved one can track you, and it goes internationally because we have someone that's detained in Jamaica, and I'm able to see the location. So this forum, I'm happy that I received the invite, even though I'm tired because I've been speaking every week. But I realize knowledge is power. The same way that man tries to spread hate, we got to spread love, and we have to stick together amongst, one another, and each one teach one. And I teach the youth. I went to a high school, YABC, it's like by Union Square, to speak to the youth because a lot of them are scared. They don't have documents. They're just going to school to get a better education. They don't know if they're going to go to college. And then going to college is still a risk because we saw what happened to that young woman in Colombia. The ICE agent acted like he was looking for someone that was missing, and he detained her. Even though I heard in the back end that our mayor has something to do with her release, that trauma lives in you forever because her immigration case is not over. I went to the immigration court maybe a year or two ago with a 4-year-old, and the judge was asking this 4-year-old, where's her lawyer? And I know she has rights even though she's a child. I said, can you give us some resources? She doesn't have a lawyer yet. Things like that break my heart because as a mother, I couldn't imagine them having a minor go to court to say why she should be in the United States. The United States is the most resourceful country in the world. And we looking at it, I live in Chelsea, not too far from here. You see privileged white people having migrants and immigrants raise their children and clean their house and cook for them. Those are the good ones that they want to keep, but everyone else have to go. That makes no sense. And then we see recently where some people were doing work in this woman's home and she called ICE on them. It's sad. And we have another case where I speak with another organization about social services. A lot of immigrants need help. So we started the accompaniment program. And basically the accompaniment program is full of volunteers throughout the 52 states. So if someone needs someone to come with them to immigration court, to the embassy, or any place, they have volunteers that would accompany them. Because people act different when they know that you have someone else watching. Because a lady, she's in a DHS shelter, her case manager gave her referral to go to 26 Federal Plaza as a resource, acting like she didn't know that she was setting her up. Things like that can't work. And I remember going through this, I was working for the Department of Education, and one of my coworkers was like, if I was you, I would just leave. And I'm like, God finally sent me a good man, because when Jean and I got together, I had a child. And any person that knows when you have your first child and you split from the dad, you become mama bear like times 10. I didn't want no man around, I didn't want nobody around her. And Jean kept bringing his son around me on the weekends when we go to, and I'm like, it's kind of weird. Like, why is he bringing his son around me? He don't know if we're going to be together. And he told me, he looked me in my eyes, he said, if I want you, I want her. It's a package deal. So finally, when I allowed him to meet her, it was love at first sight. I mean, she had a cell phone and she was only about 5. And I'm like, is he touching you? Is he, because that's the trauma that's embedded from my childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And I realized as women, we can't put trauma lasts a lifetime, but I'm in therapy, I'm getting the necessary healing, but I'm also able to tell people just because someone made a mistake, he got arrested for selling drugs. People do, our president is a rapist. You know, so as women, we have to just stick together. If anyone have any questions and they want to get involved with Families of Freedom, my information is in the chat. And we also created this movement. It's called the Connected Americans, where we connected with United We Dream. And the reason why they came up with the title Connected Americans is this is a time now when we can use our citizenship to help immigrants. Because now it's not even safe for certain, I'm not even gonna say for certain immigrants, but non-citizens to travel. Because we see how they was dragging our woman on the news in the airport, separating her from her child. That's inhumane. A child should never even see that. A woman shouldn't even be treated that way. But now they have no respect and integrity. They're putting their hands on us. They're abusing us verbally and emotionally. And we got to let them know that we're standing on business. And we may fall, but we're going to get right back up and we're going to continue this fight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janay. I always love hearing you speak because I think it's just you once said about turning pain into power.
Yes.
And I think that your story is such a beautiful illustration of that. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what got me to write my book, because I've been through so much stuff in life and things that I would never, my grandmother always said, never let outside see what's going on inside. Mm-hmm. So I may come outside being this diva, but inside, you know, it was eating me up. And I remember while he was in Haiti, our youngest, she was in an after school program, and they called to me about 6 o'clock because I got off work about 7. And they said, Janay, I need you to come pick up Shemaya. So I get there and she's crying. The first thing is like, who's bothering you? And the therapist calls me because they had therapists on site. She wanted to go to this after school that was for kids whose parents were incarcerated. So even though her dad wasn't incarcerated, I went to her later, I said he was incarcerated. Her friends went there. They had a daddy-daughter dance. And to see her crying because her dad is not there, I didn't cry. I cried later, but I didn't cry in front of her. I said, you know what? I'm going to try every tooth and nail to get their dad back, because he deserves a second chance. And to see her reunited with her dad is an amazing thing. Because when I was thinking about it, I sat there, I said, I got to write a book. I've been saying I'm going to write a book forever. And then finally, for my birthday last year, when I turned 48, I hired a book coach. Now I wrote a book. It's called You Can't Make This Shit Up. There's a lot of stuff that I've been through in life. I'm like, yeah, you can't make this up. And then even people, they gave me a surprise. My aunt had me pay to go to bowling this weekend. I'm thinking it's a family event, but they did a celebration of me writing the book. So I had a cake and, you know, little post. It was really nice. And I asked my oldest daughter, who's 27, I said, did you finish the book? She was like, Ma, I'm in therapy. I can't believe you've been through all that stuff. Because she just always thought that the life that I provided for her, she felt that only can come from someone that wasn't broken. But I said, as a mom, I made a promise to myself and to you that I'm not going to allow y'all to experience those things. And I didn't. So that's why they're brats now. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing.
Where can we get the book?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, and I have a few copies outside in my car.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Janay. So I think next we're going to hear from Raquel from Planned Parenthood. Raquel, would you be able to unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Janay, for your story and for everybody that's shared. It's so interesting how I found myself connected to the story, particularly when you talked about immigrants raising kids. My mom was actually one of those immigrants in New York City raising someone else's kids and being a nanny. And she often shares the pain that she went through and the abuse that she went through at some of these rich, affluent white families and how they treated her. And so it was very heartfelt to hear your story. But anyway, everybody, good morning. My name is Raquel. I'm excited to be joining today. I'm joining from Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm the Senior Director of Constituency Campaigns at Planned Parenthood. And I think I've heard in both presentations and both speakers talk a little bit about the rollbacks of sexual reproductive health care, the barriers that everybody, specifically migrant women, are facing when it comes to abortion. So I'm here to set a little bit of the stage in regards to what the Trump administration has actually done and some of the rollbacks that we've seen, like put some numbers behind some of the things here. I will say that in preparing for this panel, I couldn't help but to reflect on my own family's history of immigration and bodily autonomy. I'm an immigrant from Guatemala. Guatemala is a Central American country that is one of the most restrictive countries in the world when it comes to abortion. It's only allowed when the person's life is at risk. Other than that, it's completely banned. And I say that because it's so instrumental to me now being an immigrant in the United States and organizing around reproductive rights with a reproductive justice framework. And I reflect back, if I could share a quick anecdote, when I was really young and being with my mom was a single mom for many years. And I remember being at like a crossroads, like about to cross the street. And I was holding her hand and I saw this caravan of cars come down the street. They were very loud. They had these like loud mega speakers and they were blowing up images of fetal remains. And a lot of the people on that caravan of cars, I could tell visibly looked like men. And I didn't understand the context of that at the time, but that is one of the like anti-abortion tactics and anti-abortion just organizing that happens in countries like Guatemala and Central America. And I remember me and my mom, we don't usually have clammy hands, but I could tell that her hand got a little bit clammy. And I was so young that I didn't understand. I just knew it was wrong. Whatever was happening was wrong. And obviously now, having been an organizer at Planned Parenthood for a while, and then having my mom support my work, and ultimately one day having my mom share her abortion story with me in New York City when she was an immigrant herself after experiencing sexual violence, was so crucial to how I continued moving through Planned Parenthood, but also organizing outside of Planned Parenthood in a reproductive justice space. So all of this has really brought me back to that space. And I wanted to share a bit of my immigration story and like why it's so important for me to be here and like set a little bit of the stage of like what's been going on. Because of the Trump administration, we, as Janay said, we lost the federal right to abortion in the Dobbs decision that was overturned in June of 2022. And as if y'all could recall, there was actually a leak on May 1st, which is like a day before my birthday. And I'm never going to forget that day. We were in DC and we were supposed to be there for a team retreat. And lo and behold, someone leaked that they were going to overturn Roe v. Wade. And obviously we mobilized and we were at the courthouse and what have you. But I think, without that federal protection, what would happen then is that each state was left to determine if abortion would be legal or not, and under what conditions in that state. So what we've been referring to that is our state abortion bans. So as y'all know, there's 50 plus states and or territories, modern day colonialism, and every state legislature, every municipality really gets to determine access to abortion. And if you're in a state like California or even Nevada, where I live, then you're lucky because people here, the people that are in charge here are actually making sure that you have access to it. But if you're not in a state like this, it's very hard to access sexual reproductive health care. Since then, bans have eliminated some access to abortion in 21 states. That's almost half of the country. And this means that 1 in every 3 women have lost access to the right to control their bodies. 1 in 3 women in a country like the United States, that Janay referred to as like a very highly resourced place, is insane, asinine to accessing healthcare. It's completely insane. As of those remaining 29 states, and some governors and state legislatures have enshrined the right to abortion in their state constitutions. An example of that, again, is in my own home state. There are these things called ballot initiatives, which are citizen-led initiatives that remind the folks that are in charge that actually, like the majority of people in the United States, do believe in access to sexual reproductive health care. It's just very restrictive, and it's always come down to power. I think this is no surprise to you all that when a state has an abortion ban in effect, the communities that are already facing barriers to healthcare in general then face even greater barriers. That means Black, Latino, and Asian American Pacific Islanders in broad terms, but even more those who live in rural areas with low incomes, and of course, as we have been seeing, but it's been historically also part of this is immigrants, and certainly people who are undocumented and adjusting their status. For some, cost is just one barrier, but immigration status and checkpoint concerns may also inhibit traveling and accessing healthcare. I think one of the most famous, or not famous, but one of the most well-known spaces around this is like a state like Texas. It's so large that you can be in one space of the state and then travel to another to get healthcare. But in between your home and accessing healthcare, there could be an immigration checkpoint. So as a person is trying to make the decision to access healthcare, they're also potentially making a decision to not come back home to their family. And that is horrific for any person living in a country, like for anybody in general. But that's just pretty much like this first term of the Trump administration. And I think what's even more horrific is that now that we're in 2025, a second Trump administration, after they came into power, things have even gotten more complicated. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is that they've set out to defund Planned Parenthood, which has made healthcare more expensive and harder to get. I think what I mean about defunding Planned Parenthood is Planned Parenthood health centers do not receive funding from the federal government. What they do is they receive payments for services rendered. So when the Trump administration talks about how they passed a law to defund Planned Parenthood, what they really mean is that they have banned Medicaid patients from using Medicaid at Planned Parenthood health centers. And, I think it's important to note that while Planned Parenthood is well known across the country, there are also other independent providers that are doing this work that are also seeing these effects happen to them and trickle down. Because let's be real, it's not just about abortion, it's about everything. I don't understand how the Trump administration can say, we are the family, we are the party of families, like have more kids, let's build a family. But then they are removing access to Medicaid. They are preventing WIC from being funded or food stamps. They are preventing municipalities and local governments to pass accessible sexual education. It doesn't make sense. And it's always really come down to power. The consequence of this defunding since the Trump-Vance administration, it means that more than 50 Planned Parenthood health centers have closed across 20 states. That's nearly 3/4 of these closures that have been in medically underserved areas, primary care health shortage areas, or rural areas. And a lot of the times these intersect. I know that in my own state here in Nevada, we're a very large state spatially, but there's not a lot of population. So in those rural areas, there's not a lot of primary health physicians. So sometimes these areas that already have a lack of access now are seeing even less lack of access, even less people that want to become doctors and go to rural areas, and even less resources. Because we know that when a health center closes, patients don't just lose access to abortion, they lose access to birth control, cervical cancer screenings, pap smears, breast exams, and STI testing, and much more. And not just at Planned Parenthood, but in general. I know that we care at Planned Parenthood because our health centers provide 40% of all abortions nationwide, and also 33% of contraceptive for low-income women in the United States. So when they come for defunding Planned Parenthood, they're really coming for all of us, because more than half of our patients rely on Medicaid. And again, I think I'll just like to mention that these attacks are not just limited to Medicaid. Some of the things that we've seen from the Trump administration have been withholding funding from Title X family planning, and expanding the global gag rule, which is so important specifically to this feminist migration policy, which is just gutting international family planning and other reproductive health care programs. So an example, in my own home country, if there is a US funded program in Guatemala that perhaps is a radio show that is teaching rural communities about sexual health education, this is a real program that exists, but it has components about abortion, a global gag rule could prevent something like that program to not be funded anymore. And in rural areas in a Central American country like Guatemala, those are such key, crucial programs that are now being affected by the Trump administration. Other rollbacks include rolled back protections and rights for LGBTQ plus communities, undermining the Affordable Care Act, which I was a college student when I first got the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And because of them, I was able to be diagnosed from PCOS. And just in general, making misleading claims about the safety of abortion and pursuing more studies to justify access to one of the medications that assist in medicated abortion, which is mifepristone. They are coming for literally anything that has to do with bodily autonomy. It's actually sickening. And I think, in regards to like the conversation that we've been having today, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the Trump administration's continued actions against immigrant communities and the ongoing detention of thousands of people whose health and lives are even put at risk has been disgusting. ICE enforcement is just not an immigration issue; it's a public health issue. I think my colleague mentioned to me that there have been 16 documented miscarriages under the current surge of the enforcement. 16. That means that there were 16 people that were detained that didn't receive the health care that they needed. Pregnant, postpartum, and lactating women are being detained without access to adequate nutrition and medical care. And, my daughter just turned 1 last week. And as I was preparing for this panel and I was like reading some of my remarks and things that I wanted to mention, I teared up because I couldn't imagine being a postpartum mother, lactating, not being able to be around the people that I cared about that loved me, not being able to be in a comfortable space, feeling the pressure of an ICE agent coming down on me, not having access to my child in the way that I needed, or even being shackled while I gave birth. This is why it's so important to have organizers at the front lines, because people have real experiences and they're able to then determine policy changes, right, that actually move our communities. But it's just having that reflection as now still postpartum and having a 1-year-old and thinking of mothers being denied access to essential healthcare despite their acute medical distress is really disheartening. And I think that I'd like to wrap up a little bit by being very vulnerable and saying that we're currently living under a broken public healthcare system, and the Trump administration have focused their attacks on Planned Parenthood and bodily autonomy and access to abortion as a whole, just simply because Planned Parenthood provides abortions and we are unapologetic about it. They attack us through Medicaid and Title X. They do so ultimately because they want to control our bodies, our lives, and our future. And when I think about immigration, for me as an immigrant myself, bodily autonomy is a key component, if not a building block, to migration is bodily autonomy itself. And so for me, it's important for me to continue organizing in this space, because if I don't have bodily autonomy, then I'm also not able to determine anything else about my life. And I think about my mom making that decision to essentially migrate here and move us here. That in itself is reproductive justice, deciding to move out of a place that you don't deem safe and important and a place where your child can thrive to come to the United States. That's the ultimate sacrifice that I believe that immigrants make every day. And as you mentioned, Janay, actually every immigrant is worthy and it doesn't matter their story. And I know that there's this narrative of good and bad immigrant, but it's important for us not to feed into that and to really realize the holistic approach of immigration. I think, lastly, because I work at Planned Parenthood and it's so important and as an organization that has helped me personally and also professionally, we know that Planned Parenthood health centers play an integral and irreplaceable role in our healthcare system. For many patients, we are their only source of sexual and reproductive healthcare. And it is especially true for Black and Latino communities and people who live in rural areas and low incomes and those who are uninsured and the LGBTQ community, that sometimes this is the only place that they receive healthcare as a whole. For over 100 years, we've never stopped caring for patients, and we will continue to doing so and express our support and commitment to more than the 2 million patients that visit our Planned Parenthood health centers. I wanted to say thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've been taking notes, and my colleague Norma is going to drop a few links of policy report that details the full scope of the Trump administration's destructive actions to accessing healthcare reproductive rights. And I apologize, I'm still recovering from some flu, so that's why you hear me a little raspy. I hope folks take care out there. I really appreciate being part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel.
Ms. Mayuri, you need to unmute again.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you so much, Raquel, for your powerful remarks and making those links between reproductive rights and migration. I think we were at the Supreme Court together that day that Dobbs was overturned. I happened to be in DC as well, and I remember it powerfully. I think I just found out that I was pregnant that day too, so it was kind of just a very memorable moment. But I also heard in both Janay and Raquel's remarks is that, the devastating impacts of these national policies, but also how local and state-based resistance has been able to fight back against some of these things. So I think I'm holding on to that from both presentations. So next, as our final speaker of the panel, we have Janvieve, a professor at the New School and leader of Afroresistance, just to take us from there. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. First off, thank you very much for organizing this. I'm always happy to sit at a table with Families for Freedom because one of the only two organizations that are over 20 years that have really focused on Black migration out there. And I think history hasn't served us well in regards to that, to that legacy that we hold. So, Afroresistance, the Black, I'll ground us first and what Afroresistance is and what we do, and then I'll go into, the topic at hand. We're a Black woman-led political and human rights organizations that work across the whole of the Americas. Our mission is to educate and organize for human rights, democracy, and racial justice throughout the region. And we center the experiences and leadership of Black communities, particularly Black women and girls. We work across North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean because migration systems are interconnected and they reproduce similar patterns of exclusion across borders. So the policies that we see and we hear and we live in the United States have already been implemented for the most part throughout the region. Our work focuses on community-based research, advocacy, political education, and movement building with a strong emphasis on migration, racial justice, gender justice, and language justice. So I'm going to focus my remarks on three areas, which is institutionalized anti-Black racism and migration governance, the specific vulnerabilities of Black migrant women, including Black trans women and girls, and the systemic barriers faced by African migrants. And this is primarily informed by what we have learned directly from our work in Panama, especially from our recent delegation to the Darien Gap, which is the area between Panama and Colombia, which has been labeled as the most dangerous passage through the Americas. And we focus a lot on that migration, specifically because a lot of the people that cross the Darien Gap throughout Panama, Costa Rica, all the way to get to the United States, a lot of them end up in the Bronx, which is where we operate primarily in New York City. So the first point is institutionalized Black racism and migration governance. As I mentioned before, the migration systems produce unequal outcomes along racial lines. Policies on paper throughout Latin America appear neutral, but the implementation consistently disadvantages Black migrants. From our work, we see the clear pattern of Black migrants are more likely to be stopped, detained, and deported throughout any of the countries that we migrate through. They also face higher levels of racial profiling and higher levels of use of force. And this is, it doesn't discriminate between male bodies, female bodies, or even young people. And Black migrants experience longer delays in accessing asylum or protection system throughout all the countries that they migrate through. And the patterns are very consistent. And the majority of, from what we've gathered here in New York City, from the majority of the countries that Black migrants are transiting through, the pattern is consistent. Which we know then that migration governance is operating with broader racial hierarchies, and if we refuse to look at race within migration, then we are also basically compliant with these raceless policies that are also racialized. One of the key lessons from our delegation is that exclusion is not only about policy, it's also about the system design. And this is who receives information. For us as Afroresistance, it has been extremely hard because we do not collaborate or contribute to working with any government necessarily. We don't receive a lot of information that should be public information. We have to go through a lot of our researches through the university system or through the United Nations system. And even that is very like, oh, I don't know if I can share it. I don't know this, but those researches and those data are supposed to be public, and they're not being made available. We also know that it has been significant who has access to interpretation, and I'm going to get into language justice a little bit more afterwards, and then who is planned for in advance. So we have been able to do know your rights, for example, on the border of Panama and Colombia and the border of Panama and Costa Rica for people that are migrating to the United States. And from our experience, Black families are the ones that run to us because they see Black people doing these trainings, because they're not getting information about know your rights from other groups before they get to the United States. And what happens is that when they get to the United States, it's already too late a lot of times to know and to learn how to fill out those forms if they're not briefed ahead of time and prepared ahead of time. The second point is the vulnerabilities that are very specific to Black migrant women, and this includes, we always include Black trans women and girls. So the vulnerabilities are layered and very concrete. So we interviewed folks that were on their migration routes through the Darien Gap. And what we know is that there's a consistent lack of access to healthcare. We heard from women who were pregnant and walking for days without medical care or any form of intervention, women who gave birth in transit or in formal conditions without trained support, and from women who were denied care because of documentation status or discrimination within the different countries. Gender-based violence, as we all know, is also a constant risk. We heard and documented around women describing preparing for the journey with contraception because of the expectation of sexual assault in their migration. We also heard accounts of sexual violence during the transit with no access to reporting systems or care afterwards. And this was reinforced when we have met with different officials and authorities around what avenues exist for people to document and put and register their assault. And there really isn't any, specifically the documentation status and the border crossings. And then we have knowledge of situations where women are pressured to exchange sex for transportation, for protection throughout the route, or for basic necessities like food and water. And then linked to that, there are barriers within the shelters and humanitarian services in the multiple countries that migrants go through. Black women specifically shared with us that they were turned away or made to wait longer time from accessing shelters, while others who spoke Spanish or were not Black were processed and admitted faster, that they were placed in overcrowded and unsafe conditions, and that they experienced neglect or abuse from the same service providers that are paid and hired to protect them, especially from those who are not Black or do not speak their language. And for Black trans women and girls, the conditions were even more severe. We heard directly from Black trans women that are denied entry into women's shelters and that are forced into unsafe spaces or left without shelters altogether. And that they experience harassment, misgendering, and violence within the systems that are supposed to provide protection. And when we have met with different officials, they do not receive any form of training to deal with either race or with gender. And another major issue that came up over and over was the burden of caregiving, because women are often responsible for the children and elders throughout the journey. So we heard from women traveling with multiple children, sometimes not their own children. Women also making decisions around who eats, who doesn't eat, who gets to rest and when, and women carrying the emotional and physical responsibility of keeping families together under those extreme conditions, even if they're not their own children. And this caregiving role is essential to the migration trajectory, but it's not usually accounted for in most of the migration systems. And then economic vulnerability is another one that in transit. And when we say, a lot of times when we focus on migration, the focus is on the ending country where people end up. But in migration transit throughout the different countries, each country could take a month, 2 months, if they're detained 4 or 5 months, or it could just be shorter. But women, specifically women, have to hustle in those different countries where they're transiting through. So in transit, many Black migrant women cannot access formal employment, obviously due to documentation barriers in the different countries. But what that means in practice is that a lot of times they're pushed into informal work, domestic labor, childcare, street vending, where they're frequently underpaid, their passports or their documentation is withheld. Sometimes they're not paid at all. And sometimes they have to stay longer and longer because there is no money coming in with the promise of money, the promise of being paid. And we've had women that tell us that they have worked 6, 7 months and not received any pay. And then finally they decide that they have to move on with their transit. There are also basic issues of dignity. Women have described not having access to menstrual products for themselves nor their daughters during the long journeys, not having safe or private spaces to bathe or to change. There's a lot of public bathrooms or makeshift bathrooms along the way, and managing menstruation is unsafe and exposed conditions. And then there's the psychological and emotional impact, because as we know, firsthand, I know that we carry grief, fear, and trauma as we migrate, but that is usually not taken into account. What's taken into account is that you are at a specific country now and forget what came before. You're dealing with what is at hand, and then you move on to the next country, the trauma just piles on, but there's no real opportunity to share or to really work through all the stuff that came before. We saw and we know the importance of intentional care structures that have clear communication systems and that account for language accessibility in that care. There also needs to be more protocols for emotional and mental health support, and there needs to be safer spaces that prioritize dignity and safety, including for trans migrants. And then something specific to, and I say African migrants, but it's Black migrants, African descendant migrants. And throughout the region, there is an increased number of Africans from the continent, right? So this is this is not new. There's a large number of migrants that are transiting by foot. And some of the things that's very specific to these migrants, and this also, I want to also say this includes Black migrants from Brazil, Black migrants from Haiti as well, is the language access. It's a crisis in the region, especially because many of the African migrants that are coming in speak French, Portuguese, Arabic, Urdu, and other African languages, and they encounter systems that operate only in Spanish or English. And this is exactly the same for the Brazilian and for the Haitian communities that are migrating. Without that really important interpretation, access to asylum, the legal processes, and the services become very limited, almost invisible for them. And then there's the institutional exclusion, because migration systems throughout the Americas, specifically Latin America, are not designed with African people in mind, period. And this leads to delays and a lot of gaps in the protection. Add to that the layered systemic racism and the social racism that the countries that they're transiting through already has. Anti-Blackness is alive and well. It's thriving in our countries throughout Latin America. So racial profiling and social isolation increase. And it increases not only because of the people that are hired and brought on to protect them, but also through the people that they're migrating with from Latin America that happen not to be Black. One of the key lessons is that Black migrants are hyper visible all the time because we're Black, and we're always perceived as being out of place, which increases exposure to discrimination within migration itself, but also to the policing and the policies and the institutions within the countries that they migrate through. One of the key lessons in our delegation was the importance of inclusive and accessible communication systems that prioritize translation and interpretation as a core function and not as an afterthought. Like, oh, can somebody here speak this language? And then anybody that speaks English or Spanish and that other language mashed up is good enough. Like, there's no intention around it. So to finalize, across all three of the areas, the issue is structural. Addressing institutionalized anti-Blackness in migration, governance requires recognizing that there are racial disparities in the migration outcomes and that there is racism in the countries that migrants migrate through or transiting through. We have to ensure that language justice is a standard part of all migration systems, from advocacy to phone lines to in person. And we also know that there is a lack of understanding of language justice from our organization specifically. It's really hard to fundraise for language justice, and people do not want to, people do not think that they need to pay somebody for interpretation and translation. There also needs to be an intentional design of gender responsive policies that explicitly include Black women, explicitly include Black trans women and girls. Building systems of care and protection need to be proactive, not reactive. And we need to invest in Black-led organizations that are already working directly with communities. Afroresistance, and I'm sure Families for Freedoms and the other organizations we get called in at the end. And we need to be funded to be there at the beginning. And that goes across most white-led institutions and systems and organizations that are really well funded. They leave our organizations at the end, or they just throw us like, oh, you're Black, go with them. You're Black, go with them.
Yeah.
So we become like a parachute catching and we're underfunded. From our perspective, this is not an issue, it's just improving migration policies. We need to ensure that the systems are designed with us in mind, and that means us being at these types of tables to respond to the realities that people are actually living. And if we don't invest in that, and if we are not present, this is going to continue and it's going to keep on escalating. And the policies that reign supreme over in the United States that are already manifested throughout the region are going to just keep on increasing, and things are going to become more volatile and more insecure for people that are migrating. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janvieve, for such a deeply researched and vivid illustration of the racialized structures that Shanti had opened, the description of the report with. So I think, yeah, and the call for language justice definitely recognize that. I recognize we don't have interpretation on this call, for example, but it's so important. So I think we're running a little bit over. So if you have questions, I'll ask you to put them in the chat, or Shuz is going to put the email for Women in Migration so we can get back to any questions
And for
later on.
Afroresistance.
Oh, and for Afroresistance too.
Thank you.
If you have questions, because I recognize from the chat introductions as well, there's a lot of expertise on this call, and I'm sure a lot of experiences to share. But I did just want to leave some time for Roula to present the Feminist Migration Manifesto, which is being released for signatures in advance of the International Migration Review Forum next week. So I'll hand it over to Roula to introduce that and close.
Thank you so much, Mayuri. I also want to recognize our co-conveners for today's meeting. So that is the UUST, that is also the CMGJ, that is also Afroresistance. And I would like to recognize Madrid for providing us with a space to have this hybrid meeting, and to recognize all the expertise around the table. What has been mentioned here deeply resonates with what we are trying to work on. And also, since everybody has been so personal, I am compelled to share bits of the personal journey of mine. I similarly lived as a migrant in different places around the world. And then when I have arrived to the US and the Trump administration was elected for a second time, and I would hear conversations among citizens about, like, what is your plan B? What are you going to do now with this crackdown? And I was thinking, the US kind of was my plan F at this point after moving around the world. But also, I mean, I was a patient at Planned Parenthood. My life is intertwined with every service that you provide here and every bit of knowledge that you support women with, and the sisterhood. And I want to highlight something that it wasn't like said verbatim, but what I have been hearing around this table is that the anti-migration project, the anti-abortion project, the anti-Blackness project, all of these projects are eugenicist in nature, because sometimes what is left unspoken is that these words are spoken as euphemism. When some folk employ care workers in their house, it's not that they respect their labor, they actually want that labor and want it for free and want it to be exploited, and nobody who's not cleaning their kitchen is allowed into the country, and no reform to the exploitative labor systems is allowed. When we are talking also about the crackdown on migrants, I'll speak from my country. I'm from Tunisia, and certain European countries are promoting right now, also in the lead up to the International Migration Review Forum, a misleading terminology about the route-based innovative solutions for migration governance, which literally means externalizing borders onto the shores of North Africa, externalizing borders into Latin America, in order for detention centers to be created there, for those governments to do the dirty job of hunting down, creating entire witch hunts against migrants. So Tunisia, being in the north of Africa, has a lot of people crossing from the continent towards Europe. And once they are on European shores, Europe is supposed to provide pathways towards regularization, and Europe does not want to do that. So what's currently happening in Tunisia is that Italy is paying off the Tunisian government, and Tunisia is doing a witch hunt against sub-Saharan migrants. How do they recognize sub-Saharan migrants? Somebody from the room, say it, say it.
Racial profiling.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, where is Tunisia? It's in Africa. Like, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. We come in all colors. So, and shades, absolutely. And so they are just not saying it, but it's also anti-migration and anti-Black witch hunts, like gathering up people in unmarked vehicles, sending them off to the border with Libya, shooting in the air so they cross into Libya. Once they're in Libya, that's somebody else's problem. And so these are eugenicist projects, and I think that the far right understands that, because the far right understands that they have to be anti-Black, anti-migrant, anti-abortion, anti-trans, like they have to be climate deniers, etc., etc. And like, and oddly enough, that is an understanding of intersectionality in the reverse. And this is what we are trying to communicate with the sisterhood and the coalition building that we are doing in these spaces and that we are promoting in the manifesto. So we are, if you subscribe, and Chus will post our newsletter into the chat box, you will be receiving a Feminist Manifesto for Structural Transformation and Migration Governance that speaks specifically to these intersections and what are the migrant-led feminist demands that we have in mind that need to be addressed and that we need to hold on to, because it is not the time for complacency, for euphemisms. We need to call things what they are, and there is really no justification for any of the policies that are being proposed here, because if we believe in the moral equality of humans, and we do, there is simply no justification for all of that is unfolding, and they are coming for all of us, like, which is what I've heard around the room, like for the different positionalities that we occupy, the different vulnerabilities that we have. They're not saying it verbatim, but we have seen it unfold on the ground. So please sign up and like also visit our website, and just is leaving the information of all of the organizations that are present here in this room in the chat box, and we encourage you to sign on to the manifesto in order to endorse it and be able to utilize it as an advocacy tool ahead of this important event unfolding in the first week of May. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But again, we'll try and get back to any questions via email. And yeah, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Choose take a picture, a screenshot. And people also like open up your cameras maybe. Yes. It's great to see everyone. Oh, I see so many familiar and so many new
I'm just waiting
faces.
for more cameras to be open so I can take a picture with everybody who is here. So just giving you a little bit of time.
Excellent.
All right, you ready? Then going. Perfect. Done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us today.
Fine.
Okay. And
Bye.
yes. Yeah. And before the ladies leave us, like we want to like just get something like for which I told you about. Yeah.